Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Okay, welcome back. As promised, we are going to continue on with our reading and discussion of the first 4 chapters of Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, where he is developing the moral argument. This is an exploration in philosophy, specifically moral philosophy, and foundation building for a religious worldview. And that's the project of Mere Christianity. It's such a wonderful book, as he, in the first part of the book, really provides the philosophical foundations to establish the validity and truth of the Christian worldview. And then after that, he begins to explore the implications, the theology, and so on. And in a very interesting way, his lead-in to Christianity is the famous moral argument, which almost everybody misunderstands or gets wrong. And part of the reason I wanted to read C.S. Lewis is he does such a clear and good job explaining this. So we're just going to dive right in. If you haven't listened to the first part of this, you definitely need to do that. Otherwise, this is going to make no sense. I'm putting these episodes back to back for that reason. After this part, however, I'm going to put some space between this just to get some different material in here. But I figured these first 4 chapters really had to go together because they're really the full argument in its total package, so it wouldn't make sense to separate them out. Other than that, I'll do what we did last time. I'll read the chapter and then offer my comments at the end. Please forgive me as I take time to turn pages here and crinkliness. I'm old school. I don't read off of a Kindle. I like paper and making notes and folding pages and all that. So we're now in chapter 3. This is called The Reality of the Law. I now go back to what I said at the end of the first chapter, that there were 2 odd things about the human race. First, that they were haunted by the idea of a sort of behavior they ought to practice, what you might call fair play or decency or morality or the law of nature. Second, that they did not in fact do so. Now some of you may wonder why I call this odd. It may seem to you the most natural thing in the world. In particular, you may have thought I was rather hard on the human race. After all, you may say, what I call breaking the law of right and wrong, or of nature, only means that people are not perfect. And why on earth should I expect them to be? That would be a good answer if what I was trying to do was fix the exact amount of blame which is due for us for not behaving as we expect others to behave. But that is not my job at all. I am not concerned at present with blame. I am trying to find out truth. And from that point of view, the very idea of something being imperfect, of its not being what it ought to be, has certain consequences. If you take a thing like a stone or a tree, it is what it is, and there seems to be no sense in saying it ought to have been otherwise. Of course, you may say a stone is, quote, the wrong shape, if you want to use it for a rockery, or that a tree is a bad tree because it does not give you as much shade as you expected, but all you mean is that the stone or the tree does not happen to be convenient for some purposes of your own. You are not, except as a joke, blaming them for that. You really know that, given the weather and the soil, the tree could not have been any different. What we, from our point of view, call a bad tree is obeying the law of its nature just as much as a good one. Now, have you noticed what follows? It follows that what we usually call the laws of nature, the way weather works on a tree, for example, may not really be laws in the strict sense, but only in a manner of speaking. When you say that falling stones always obey the law of gravitation, is not this much the same as saying that the law only means, quote, what stones always do? You do not really think that when a stone is let go, it suddenly remembers that it is under orders to fall to the ground. You only mean that, in fact, it does fall. In other words, you cannot be sure that there is anything over and above the facts themselves, any law about what ought to happen as distinct from what does happen. The laws of nature, as applied to stones or trees, may only mean what nature in fact does. But if you turn to the law of human nature, the law of decent behavior, it is a different matter. That law certainly does not mean what human beings in fact do, for as I said before, many of them do not obey this law at all, and none of them obey it completely. The law of gravity tells you what stones do if you drop them, but the law of human nature tells you what human beings ought to do and do not. In other words, when you are dealing with humans, something else comes in above and beyond the actual facts. You have the facts, how men do behave, and you also have something else, how they behave. In the rest of the universe, there need not be anything but the facts. Electrons and molecules behave in a certain way, and certain results follow, and that may be the whole story. But men behave in a certain way, and that is not the whole story. For all the time you know that they ought to have behaved differently. Now, this is really so peculiar that one is tempted to try to explain it away. For instance, we might try to make out that when you say a man ought not to act as he does, you only mean the same as when you say that a stone is the wrong shape, namely, that what he is doing happens to be inconvenient to you. But this is simply untrue. A man occupying the corner seat in the train because he got there first, and a man who slipped into it while my back was turned and removed my bag are both equally inconvenient. But I blame the second man and do not blame the first. I am angry, except perhaps for a moment before I come to my senses, with a man who trips me up by accident. I am angry with a man who tries to trip me up even if he does not succeed. Yet the first has hurt me and the second has not. Sometimes the behavior which I call bad is not inconvenient to me at all, but the very opposite. In war, each side may find a traitor on the other side very useful, but though they use him and pay him, they regard him as human vermin. So you cannot say that what we call decent behavior in others is simply the behavior that happens to be useful to us. And as for decent behavior in ourselves, I suppose it is pretty obvious that it does not mean the behavior that pays. It means things like being content with 30 shillings when you might have gotten £3, doing schoolwork honestly when it would be easy to cheat, leaving a girl alone when you would like to make love to her, staying in dangerous places when you would rather go somewhere safer, keeping promises you would rather not keep, and telling the truth even when it makes you look a fool. Some people say mystery about it. Human beings, after all, have some sense. They see that you cannot have any real safety or happiness except in a society where everyone plays fair, and it is because they see this that they try to behave decently. Now, of course, it is perfectly true that safety and happiness can only come from individuals, classes, and nations being honest and fair and kind to each other. It is one of the most important truths in the world. But as an explanation of why we feel as we do about right and wrong, it just misses the point. If we ask, why ought I to be unselfish? And you reply, because it is good for society, we may then ask, why should I care what's good for society, except when it happens to pay me personally? And then you will have to say, because you ought to be unselfish, which simply brings us back to where we started. You are saying what is true, but you're not getting any further. If a man asked what was the point of playing football, it would not be much good saying in order to score goals. For trying to score goals is the game back to where we started. You are saying what is true, but you're not getting any further. If a man asked what was the point of playing football, it would not be much good saying in order to score goals. For trying to score goals is the game itself, not the reason for the game, and you would really only be saying that football was football, which is true, but not worth saying. In the same way, if a man asks what is the point of behaving decently, it is no good replying in order to benefit society. For trying to benefit society, in other words, being unselfish, is one of the things decent behavior consists in. All you really are saying is that decent behavior is decent behavior. You would have said just as much if you had stopped at the statement, men ought to be selfish. And that is where I do not stop. Men ought to be unselfish, ought to be fair. Not that men are unselfish, not that they like being unselfish, but they ought to be. The moral law or law of human nature is not simply a fact about human behavior. Cannot get rid of the idea, and most of the things we say and think about men would be reduced to nonsense if we did. And it is not simply a statement about how we should like men to behave for our own convenience. For the behavior we call bad or unfair is not exactly the same as the behavior we find inconvenient and may even be the opposite. Consequently, this rule of right and wrong, or law of human nature, or whatever you call it, must somehow or other be a real thing. A thing that is really there, not made up by ourselves. And yet it is not a fact in the ordinary sense, in the same way as some of our actual behavior is a fact. it begins to look as if we shall have to admit that there is more than one kind of reality, that in this particular case there is something above and beyond the ordinary facts of man's behavior, and yet quite definitely real, a real law which none of us made, but which we find pressing on us. So Lewis is finally starting to converge to his point of trying to provide the ontological foundations for an objective moral realm. And if you remember from the first discussion, when we say that morality is objective, we mean that it's something that is valid and binding apart from human opinion. It's real. It's a feature of the world that moral facts really do attain. And Lewis is probing us, and he's trying to push us, again, through our basic moral experience of showing that not only are these facts immediately obvious, but when we reflect upon them, we certainly have no good reason to deny the realness or existence of moral facts, of morality being objective. So he's continuing to affirm this position of moral realism. And in this chapter, he's kind of just, wading through a series of other objections against it. And part of it, he's actually, whether you picked it up or not, he's kind of arguing against utilitarianism in a sense here. Is saying, like, look, what is good behavior isn't necessarily what's convenient for us or what makes us happy. In fact, we can think of many instances where the right thing to do might cause us to look like a fool. It might cause us pain. It might be super inconvenient for us. So it's not some type of prudential thing that's just convenient. And in fact, we might get initially angry at the person who accidentally tripped us up, but once we realize it was an accident, we don't really stay angry at him. But we certainly get angry at the person who tried to trip us. And even if he didn't succeed, even if he really didn't inconvenience us, we feel this guy tried to do something wrong to us. So we can't equate what is morally right or wrong with what is convenient or inconvenient. And then the same thing, he just kind of exposes this tautology of saying, what is good is what benefits society. But then people ask, well, why should I do what's good for society? And they say, well, because you should do what's good for society. It just goes in a circle. So he's saying, no, we need to unpack this. We can't just run our definition of morality in an endless circle and think we've actually explained anything. Why is it good to do those things that benefit society? We all know that decent behavior is what benefits other people, that being but why? Why should we care about this? What is this moral law? Why is it pressing on us? Why are we under any obligation to obey it? And this is the part that he's finally getting at. He's establishing the validity of a real moral law. That's what he's been doing in these first couple of chapters through both our moral experience and seeing why the most common objections to them really just don't have any force. So once he secures the foundations for moral realism, which I think he's doing a very good job, has to say on that. This is chapter 4, What Lies Behind the Law? Let us sum up what we have reached so far. In the case of stones and trees and things of that sort, what we call the laws of nature may not be anything except a way of speaking. When you say that nature is governed by certain laws, this may only mean that nature does in fact behave in a certain way. The so-called laws may not be anything real, anything above and beyond the actual facts which we observe. But in the case of man, we saw that this will not do. The law of human nature, or of right and wrong, must be something above and beyond the actual facts of human behavior. In this case, besides the actual facts, you have something else, a real law which we did not invent and which we know we ought to obey. I now want to consider what this tells us about the universe we live in. Ever since men were able to think, they have been wondering what this universe really is and how it came to be there, and which we know we ought to obey. I now want to consider what this tells us about the universe we live in. Ever since men were able to think, they have been wondering what this universe really is and how it came to be there. And, very roughly, two views have been held. First, there is what is called the materialist view. People who take that view think that matter and space just happen to exist and have always existed, nobody knows why, and that the matter behaving in certain fixed ways has just happened by a sort of fluke to produce creatures like ourselves who are able to think. By one chance in 1,000 something hit our sun and made it produce the planets, and by another thousandth chance the chemicals necessary for life and the right temperature occurred on one of these planets, and so some of the matter on this earth came alive, and then by a very long series of chances the living creatures developed into things like us. The other view is the religious view. According to it, what is behind to another, and on this view it made the universe. Partly for purposes we do not know, but partly, at any rate, in order to produce creatures like itself. I mean, like itself to the extent of having minds. Please do not think that one of these views was held a long time ago, and that the other has gradually taken its place. Wherever there have been thinking men, both views turn up. And note this too. You cannot find out which view is the right one by science in the ordinary sense. Science works by experiments. It watches how things behave. Every scientific statement in the long run, however complicated it looks, really means something like, quote, I pointed the telescope to such and such a part of the sky at 2:20 a.m. on January 15th and saw so-and-so. Or, quote, I put some of this stuff in a pot and heated it to such and such a temperature and it did so-and-so. Do not think I am saying anything against science. I am only saying what its job is. And the more scientific a man is, the more I believe he would agree with me that this is the job of science. And a very useful and necessary job it is, too. But why anything comes to be there at all, and whether there is anything behind the things science observes, something of a different kind, this is not a scientific question. If there is, quote, something behind, then either it will have to remain altogether unknown to men, or else make itself known in some different way. The statement that there is any such thing, and the statement that there is no such thing, are neither of them statements that science can make, and real scientists do not usually make them. It is usually the journalists and popular novelists who have picked up a few odds and ends of half-baked science from textbooks who go in for them. After all, it is really a matter of common sense. Supposing science ever became complete so that it knew every single thing in the whole universe, it is not plain that the question, quote, why is there a universe? Why does it go on in the way it does? Has it any meaning? Would remain just as they were. Now, the position would be quite hopeless but for this. There is one thing, and only one thing, in the whole universe which we know more about than we could learn from external observation. That one thing is man. We do not merely observe men. We are men. In this case, we have, so to speak, inside information. We are in the know. And because of that, we know that men find themselves under a moral law, which they did not make and cannot quite forget even when they try, and which they know they ought to obey. Notice the following point. Anyone studying man from the outside, as we study electricity or cabbages, not knowing our language and consequently not able to get any inside knowledge from us, but merely observing what we did, would never get the slightest evidence that we had this moral law. How could he? For his observations would only show what we did. The moral law is about what we ought to do. In the same way, if there were anything above or behind the observed facts in the case of stones or the weather, we, by studying them from outside, could never hope to discover it. The position of the question, then, is like this. We want to know whether the universe simply happens to be what it is for no reason, or whether there is a power behind it that makes it what it is. Since that power, if it exists, would be not one of the observed facts, but a reality which makes them, no mere observation of the facts can find it. There is only one case in which we can know whether there is anything more, namely our own case. And in that one case we find there is. Or, put it the other way round. If there was a controlling power outside the universe, it could not show itself to us as one of the facts inside the universe, no more than the architect of a house could actually be a wall or a staircase or a fireplace in that house. The only way in which we find inside ourselves. Surely this ought to arouse our suspicions. In the only case where you can expect to get an answer, the answer turns out to be yes. And in the other cases, where you do not get an answer, you see why you do not. Suppose someone asks me when I see a man in blue uniform going down the street, leaving little paper packets at each house, why I suppose that they contain letters. I should reply, because whenever he leaves a similar little packet for me, I find that it does contain a letter. And if he then objected, "But you've never seen all these letters, which you think the other people are getting." I should say, "Of course not, and I shouldn't expect to, because they're not addressed to me. I'm explaining the packets I'm not allowed to open by the ones I am allowed to open. It is the same about this question. The only packet I am allowed to open is man. When I do, especially when I open that particular packet called myself, I find that I do not exist on my own, that I am under. It is the same about this question. The only packet I am allowed to open is man. When I do, especially when I open that particular packet called myself, I find that I do not exist on my own, that I am under a law, that somebody or something wants me to behave a certain way. I do not, of course, think that if I could get inside a stone or a tree, I should find exactly the same thing, just as I do not think all the other people in the street get the same letters as I do. I should expect, for instance, to find that the stone had to obey the law of gravity, that whereas the sender of the letters merely tells me to obey the law of my human nature, he compels the stone to obey the laws of its stony nature. But I should expect to find that there was, so to speak, a sender of letters in both cases, a power behind the facts, a director, a guide. Do not think I am going faster than I really am. I am not yet within 100 miles of the God of Christian theology. All I have got to is a something which is directing the universe and which appears in me as a law urging anything else we know. Because after all, the only other thing we know is matter, and you can hardly imagine a bit of matter giving instructions. But of course, it need not be very like a mind, still less like a person. In the next chapter, we shall see if we can find out anything more about it. But one word of warning. There has been a great deal of soft soap talked about God for the last 100 years. That is not what I am offering. You can cut all that out. Note, in order to keep this section short enough when it was given on the air, I mentioned only the materialist view and the religious view. But to be complete, I ought to mention the in-between view called life force philosophy or creative evolution or emergent evolution. The wittiest expositions of it come from the works of Bernard Shaw, but the most prominent ones in those of Bergson. People who hold this view say that the small variations by which life on this planet evolved from the lowest forms of man were not due to chance but to the striving or purposeness of life force. When people say this, we must ask them, small variations by which life on this planet evolved from the lowest forms of man were not due to chance but to the striving or purposeness of life force. When people say this, we must ask them whether by life force they mean something with a mind or not. If they do, then a mind bringing life into existence and leading it to perfection is really a god, and their view is thus identical with the religious. If they do not, then what is the sense in saying that something without a mind strives or, quote, has purposes? This seems to me fatal to their view. One reason many people find creative evolution so attractive is that it gives one much of the emotional comfort of believing a God and none of the less pleasant consequences. When you are feeling fit and the sun is shining, and you do not want to believe that the whole universe is a mere mechanical dance of atoms, it is nice to be able to think of this great, mysterious force rolling on through the centuries and carrying you on its crest. If, on the other hand, you want to do something rather shabby, the life force, being only a blind force with no morals and no mind, bother you. All the thrills of religion and none of the cost. Is the life force the greatest achievement of wishful thinking the world has seen yet? So we're not done yet. We actually have to continue on through the next couple of chapters, because he does continue to develop the argument further. But let's spend some time reflecting on what C.S. Lewis is getting at here. So he's saying, okay, we have this real moral experience, that there's something pressing upon us that seems to include both moral values and duties. Now, moral values are talking about things like good and bad, whereas moral duties are talking about right and wrong, of what you ought to do and what you ought not to do. Multiple things can be good, but it doesn't mean you have an obligation or a duty to follow those good things. For example, it might be good for you to be a doctor, but also might be good for you to be a nurse or a lawyer or whatever. So we wouldn't want to say that you have a moral obligation to do any one of those things, at least not with further context. So they can all be good, but moral values are still distinct from moral duties. So we have to be able to account for both of these, because both of these are real in our moral experience, in the sense that we know some things are good, we know other things are bad, but also we have this very deep, real sense that we ought to do and pursue things that are good and avoid things that are wicked, evil, etc. How do we account for this? Well, Lewis is now saying, okay, there's kind of like two ways of looking at the world. There's the materialist view. I would now say the naturalist view, or metaphysical naturalism, where only physical things exist. And there is the religious worldview in its kind of full scope or grand scope. And he says the starting points of these two worldviews are radically different. If metaphysical naturalism exists, it seems like we can't really make sense of our moral experience. Morality is not something that we can see through a telescope. It's not something we could distill in a test tube. It's not something we can know about through the investigation of how one physical thing or one physical process leads to the result of another physical thing or another physical process. Morality is not some physical thing. And he shows that if you fall into this camp of scientism, of thinking that the only way of knowing is a scientific way of knowing, of the investigation of etiology, or how one physical event leads to another physical event, you're always going to be missing something. And there's a classic example of this, and that is our own selves. Consciousness, for example, is not something that we can know through the scientific process. For example, nothing about neuroscience, nothing about taking a third-person objective view of the brain would ever tell us, nor could it even in principle tell us, that there is a first-person subjective sense of self somewhere inhabiting that person. The only reason we know that, the only reason we think we know that, is because we are that first-person subjective sense of person, and we just believe that other people have minds like us. But that is a basic philosophical assumption, that other people have minds. There's nothing about the scientific enterprise that has ever verified that, or could in principle ever verify that, because it's not a physical thing. So while we can show very strong correlations between brain states and conscious activity, we cannot establish that consciousness exists at all, period, through the scientific enterprise. We just assume that it exists because it's the most fundamental and immediate experience we have. And Lewis is saying, hey, look, the same thing is true of the moral law. There's nothing about a scientific or empirical investigation of the world, fundamental and immediate experience we have. And Lewis is saying, hey, look, the same thing is true of the moral law. There's nothing about a scientific or empirical investigation of the world looking just at the structure of physical reality that would give us any clue at all that there's such a thing as a moral law pressing upon us. The only reason we do know of this is because of our basic and immediate moral experience. And what he presses, he doesn't say it exactly this way, is like, look, we all believe that we have minds. In fact, you can't even coherently deny it. The fact that you try to deny that you have a mind, it asks, well, who's doing the denying? Some people, some materialists, some naturalists, for example, say that consciousness is an illusion. You can't even get away with that, because then it just begs the question of, well, who's having the illusion? It just kicks the problem back a step. So it's this very basic foundational belief that you can't escape unless we do believe that we're capable of observing things through our minds and that our cognitive faculties are generally reliable. So, if you're warm to the sciences, which you should be, then you just need to have a proper view of what sciences can tell us and what they can't tell us. And philosophers have known this for a very long time, that, science really has nothing to tell us about a great many things. It can't tell us about mathematics, for example. It has to presuppose mathematics. It can't tell us about logic. It has to presuppose logic. It can't tell us about morality, which Lewis is saying. It can't tell us about the existence of other minds. And it can't even tell us that we should follow science to begin with. So the proposition that you should only believe things that can be scientifically verified is itself not a statement that can be scientifically verified. It's self-referentially undermining. It doesn't even meet its own standards. So he's kind of poking holes. Scientism wasn't around at the time of Lewis, but certain other schools of thought, like logical positivism, which were very similar. And what he's saying is like, look, there's many ways of knowing, and the most immediate is just our basic inside moral experience. And when we reflect on that, we see that there's certain features of the world that are fundamental and basic, that the basic inside moral experience. And when we reflect on that, we see that there's certain features of the world that are fundamental and basic that the sciences cannot in principle get at, but they're obviously extremely real. The existence of my mind, the existence of consciousness, the existence of this moral law. And then what he's doing is he's saying this cannot be made sense of on a materialistic worldview, on a naturalistic worldview. Because if only physical things exist, if that's the view, and morality is not a physical thing, you really have to say that all morality is just an illusion. It's some type of pattern of behavior or patterns of behavior that were fobbed off by the socio-bioevolutionary process that really do not map on to any real features of the world. They just have adaptive benefit. But there's nothing really wrong about raping. There's nothing really wrong about incest or slavery or murder. They're just kind of they were in the process of evolution, say, somewhat maladaptive. But if you were to rewind the evolutionary clock and run it all over again, we might have evolved with a very different sense of morality. We might have evolved thinking that rape was a good thing, but we all know that that's ridiculous, right? We all know that no, rape is really wrong in and of itself. Now, it's important to understand that evolution by itself does not answer the question. Evolution is only a problem on a naturalistic worldview for morality. Because if the religious worldview is right, then we can trust that the evolutionary process guided our moral development to discover something real about the world. That's the key. On the religious worldview, we have no reason to think that evolution would have tracked truth, for example, and that we came to discover these moral realities rather than invent them. But on naturalism and materialism, we don't have that option. Really, we're reduced to saying that these must be inventions. Our basic moral experience, some things are not just wrong, but they seem necessarily wrong. Like in any possible conceivable world or universe, harming and mutilating an innocent child is wrong. That's not just socially taboo. In any possibly conceivable, universe, taking advantage and raping people is wrong. It's not just socially taboo. And we all know this deep down, but this has a severe tension to the materialist and naturalist worldview. It cannot account for it. In fact, it has to write it off as an illusion. So what Lewis is trying to show is that our moral experience is explained very, very well by one particular worldview and really not explained at all, or to the extent that it can be explained, has to be dismissed by the other worldview, which would be metaphysical naturalism or materialism. And he hasn't got to the point of pressing it exactly just yet, but the reality of our moral experience is so overwhelming, and there's no good reason to deny it. There's no, we would say, overriding defeater of it, that we're perfectly rational of holding to this view. But then if that's the case, then we should use this to inform our greater metaphysical worldview. Because the only reason that we would deny that morality is a real feature of the world is if we're starting from the position of metaphysical naturalism or materialism. But Lewis is showing, no, look, we have evidence that worldview is wrong. We have the existence of minds. We have the existence of the moral law. And this evidence is far stronger and far greater than any of these other arguments that you could give for that worldview. Therefore, that worldview should be rejected, and what we should investigate as the sort of ontological foundations of how we can explain this moral law is the religious worldview. And as he admits here, he's just thinking about this philosophically. He's not saying that once you affirm this, it means Christianity is true. He's only saying that once we affirm this, metaphysical naturalism or materialism isn't true. It must be something it must be some form of the religious worldview that is correct in the grand scheme of things. So he's being very careful here. You can tell he's done his work as a philosopher, right? Just taking his time. He's kind of inching his way forward. He's not skipping any steps. He's being very careful. And that's something I've always appreciated about Lewis. He's looking at objections. He's responding to objections. He's being very stepwise as he's kind of making his way. So he's really building a cumulative case as we move forward. So that's where we're at. We're seeing to the only extent it can be explained, it has to be dismissed, which we all know is ridiculous. There's no reason to do that. This is a properly basic belief, like the existence of minds, consciousness, intentionality, all these different things. It's as real and we're as rational to affirm it as the existence of the outside world. But this can only be explained or at least made sense of in a religious or I would say supernatural worldview. So we can dismiss naturalism and we have to start to consider some form of supernaturalism being true. Not any one particular religion, but at least something like the religious worldview or supernatural worldview. And that's where he's at. And then he makes us note at the end talking about this idea of life force, and he kind of smirks at it. He's like, he calls it wishful thinking. He's like, yeah, what a pleasant thing. It gives you the peace of mind when you're feeling good that there's some purpose to life. But then, when you feel like doing something shabby, he says it's not gonna good that there's some purpose to life. But then, when you feel like doing something shabby, he says it's not gonna hold you morally culpable or reliable. So how nice, but that. And then he rightfully dismisses that. So why don't we? Because I don't want to leave you hanging. There's one more chapter here, chapter 5, that I want to finish with, and we'll offer some comments. So this is chapter 5. We have cause to be uneasy. I ended my last chapter with the idea that in the moral law, somebody or something from beyond the material universe was actually getting at us. And I expect when I reached that point, some of you felt a certain annoyance. You may even have thought that I played a trick on you, that I had been carefully wrapping up to look like philosophy what turns out to be more, quote, religious jaw. You may have felt you were ready to listen to me as long as you thought I had anything new to say, but if it turns out to be only religion, well, the world has tried that, and you cannot put the clock back. If anyone is feeling that way, I should like to say 3 things to him. First, as to putting the clock back, would you think I was joking if I said that you can put a clock back, and that if the clock is wrong, it is often a very sensible thing to do? But I would rather get away from the whole idea of clocks. We all want progress. But progress means getting nearer to the place you want to be. And if you have taken a wrong turning, then to go forward does not get you any nearer. If you're on the wrong road, progress means doing a turnabout and walking back to the right road. And in that case, the man who turns back soonest is the most progressive man. We have all seen this when doing arithmetic. When I have started a sum the wrong way, the sooner I admit this and go back and start again, the faster I shall get on. There is nothing progressive about being pig-headed and refusing to admit a mistake. And I think if you look at the present state of the world, it is pretty plain that humanity has been making some big mistakes. We are on the wrong road. And if that is so, then secondly, this has not yet turned exactly into a, quote, religious jaw. We have not yet got so far as the God of any actual religion, still less the God of that particular religion called Christianity. We have only got as far as a somebody or something behind the moral law. We are not taking anything from the Bible or the churches. We are trying to see what we can find out about this somebody on our own steam. And I want to make it quite clear that what we find out on our own steam is something that gives us a shock. We have 2 bits of evidence about the somebody. One is the universe he has made. If we use that as our only clue, then I think we should have to conclude that he was a great artist, for the universe is a very beautiful place, but also that he is quite merciless and no friend to man, for the universe is a very dangerous and terrifying place. The other bit of evidence is that moral law which he put into all of our minds, and this is a better bit of evidence than the other, because it is inside information. You find out more about God from the moral law than by looking at a house he has built. Now, from this second bit of evidence, we conclude that the being behind the universe is intensely interested in right conduct, in fair play, unselfishness, courage, good faith, honesty, and truthfulness. In that sense, we should agree with the account given by Christianity and some other religions that God is good. But do not let us go too fast here. The moral law does not give us any grounds for thinking that God is good in the sense of being indulgent or soft or sympathetic. There is nothing indulgent about the moral law. It is as hard as nails. It tells you to do the straight thing, and it does not seem to care how painful or dangerous or difficult it is to do. If God is like the moral law, then he is not soft. It is no use at this stage saying that what you mean by a good God is a God who can forgive. You are going too quickly. Only a person can forgive, and we have not yet got so far as a personal God. Only as far as a power behind the moral law is a God who can forgive. You are going too quickly. Only a person can forgive, and we have not yet got so far as a personal God. Only as far as a power behind the moral law, and more like a mind than it is like anything else. But it may still be very unlike a person. If it is pure impersonal mind, there may be no sense in asking it to make allowances for you or to let you off, just as there is no sense in asking the multiplication table to let you off when you do your sums wrong. You are bound to get the wrong answer. And it is no use either saying that if there is a God of that sort, an impersonal absolute goodness, then you do not like him and are not going to bother about him. For the trouble is that one part of you is on his side and really agrees with his disapproval of human greed and trickery and exploitation. You may want him to make an exception in your own case, to let you off this one time, but you know at bottom that unless the power behind the world really and unalterably detests that sort of behavior, then he cannot be good. On the other side of what we do. This is the terrible fix we are in. If the universe is not governed by an absolute goodness, then all our efforts are in the long run hopeless. But if it is, then we are making ourselves enemies to that goodness every day, and are not in the least likely to do any better tomorrow, and so our case is hopeless again. We cannot do without it, and we cannot do with it. God is the only comfort. He is also the supreme terror, the thing we most need and the thing we most want to hide from. He is our only possible ally, and we have made ourselves his enemies. Some people talk as if meeting the gaze of absolute goodness would be fun. They need to think again. They are still only playing with religion. Goodness is either the great safety or the great danger, according to the way you react to it, and we have reacted the wrong way. Now, my third point. When I chose to get to my real subject in this roundabout way, I was not trying to play any kind of trick on you. I had a different reason. My reason was that Christianity simply does not make sense until you have faced the sort of facts I have been describing. Christianity tells people to repent and promises them forgiveness. It therefore has nothing, as far as I know, to say to people who do not know they have done anything to repent of and who do not feel that they need any forgiveness. It is after you have realized that there is a real moral law and a power behind the law, and that you have broken that law and put yourself wrong with that power. It is after all this and not a moment sooner that Christianity begins to talk. When you know you are sick, you will listen to the doctor. When you have realized that our position is nearly desperate, you will begin to understand what the Christians are talking about. They offer an explanation of how we got into our present state of both hating goodness and loving it. They offer an explanation of how God can be this impersonal mind at the back of the moral law and yet also a person. They tell you how the demands of this law, which you and I cannot meet, have been met on our behalf. How approval of God. It is an old story, and if you want to go into it, you will have no doubt you will no doubt consult people who have more authority to talk about it than I have. All I am doing is to ask people to face the facts, to understand the questions which Christianity claims to answer. And they are very terrifying facts. I wish it was possible to say something more agreeable, but I must say what I think is true. Of course, I quite agree that the Christian religion is, in the long run, a thing of unspeakable comfort. But it does not begin in comfort. It begins in the dismay I have been describing, and it is no use at all trying to go on to that comfort without first going through that dismay. In religion, as in war and everything else, comfort is the one thing you cannot get by looking for it. If you look for truth, you may find comfort in the end. If you look for comfort, you will not get either comfort or truth. Only soft soap and wishful thinking to begin with, and, in the end, despair. Most of us have gotten over the pre-war wishful thinking to begin with, and, in the end, despair. Most of us have gotten over the pre-war wishful thinking about international politics. It is time we did the same about religion. Well, thank you, C.S. Lewis, for helping to wrap that up for us. And of course, he continues on into part 2. He starts to weigh out what he calls the rival conceptions of God. So we're not quite done yet, but that rounds out the first section of the book. And there's a very kind of important part of this argument that sometimes gets overlooked, and this is when he's trying to figure out where this moral law is coming from and to figure out something about God. He says that we get better evidence from ourselves than we do by observing the universe. If we just look at the universe, it gives us pretty mixed evidence, because on one hand it's absolutely beautiful, and on the other hand it's absolutely terrifying. And he'll come back and visit this again later. To want to have a transcendent plumb line for reality, we need to have some absolute standard of goodness. This objective foothold, if you will, through which all our moral actions are measured against. And this can't be the universe, because the universe isn't an absolute standard of goodness. There's some good things about it. There's some terrifying things about it. So whatever God is, whoever God is, he must be radically distinct from the universe. He must transcend the universe. So he'll actually take the moral argument to argue against pantheism and towards monotheism. Now, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but I think that's a really important thing to show and to demonstrate, because I think a lot of people kind of fall into this pantheistic idea that God just is the universe, and they pray to the universe. And I've written other articles to show why this is really a confusion, and there's a number of arguments we can use to and they pray to the universe. And I've written other articles to show why this is really a confusion, and there's a number of arguments we can use to develop that, like the contingency argument, that the universe is contingent, it exists, but it doesn't have to exist, it could have existed some other way. But whatever God is a necessary reality, that God exists in the strongest possible sense. He could not have existed any other way. So God is immaterial, timeless, spaceless, extremely powerful, really an unrestricted act of mentation. So God is the reason the universe exists at any moment in time. He's the explanation for why there's something rather than nothing, but God is not equal to the universe. And you can show this through various lines of argument, but Lewis will take this up through the moral argument as well, and saying, look, the universe is clearly not our standard for the moral law. It's very beautiful, but it's also very frightening, and at other times there's a lot of bad stuff that goes on it. So wherever this transcend must be the reason that the universe, of course, is there, but it is not itself equal to the physical universe. So he started to plant the seeds for that. And that's what's kind of fun about the way Lewis develops his arguments, is he'll plant the seeds of one chapter, and they'll start to kind of bud up in the next, and he'll go back and revisit it. It's very joyful. I think it's really enjoyable to read this, because he gives you these, if you pay attention and you're studious, things that you read in one chapter, you'll be rewarded for that in later chapters and in later parts of the book. And that's just, of course, a testament to his writing, genius. He's not just treating this like a pure analytic philosopher. Here's premise 1, premise 2, objection. He's obviously developing the argument with careful detail, and he's addressing objections, but he's being more conversational about it. And I think that not only has that made this book incredibly accessible to people who aren't, say, professional philosophers, but again, don't underestimate this. He's really developing this argument with a lot of precision that can often be overlooked just because he's such a casual writer. He's such a professional. So I'm going to leave that there. I hope this gives you something to think about. So the moral argument, what is the moral argument attempting to show? Well, it's attempting to show that objective moral values and duties cannot exist apart from God, that naturalism, that metaphysical naturalism and materialism cannot account for objective moral values and duties. But objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, something like the religious worldview is true, that some form of supernaturalism is true, not naturalism. It's not saying, and this is important, and I do believe Lewis clarifies this at a point, it's not saying that you need to believe in God to be a good person. It's not saying that people And even back when I was a skeptic and would have considered myself a naturalist, I still think I was a pretty decent person. So that's not the argument. The argument isn't that you need to believe in God to be a good person. The argument is that we need God. We need a transcendent plumb line for there even to be any such thing as good or right to begin with. That these things don't even make sense if supernaturalism isn't true. So it's much more fundamental, and people sometimes make that mistake. It's not an indictment on a person's character based on their psychological beliefs. This is an ontological, metaphysical argument for the reality status of good and bad, right or wrong, and what the implications of those are to a general worldview of either naturalism or supernaturalism. So it's an argument through moral realism to supernaturalism. That's through moral realism to supernaturalism. That's what the argument is. So it's much more fundamental. It's in the realm of ontology, not necessarily epistemology, and somewhat technical distinctions, but really important because it's a common mistake that people make. It's not about saying that people can't behave decently if they're not religious or don't believe in it. That's not the argument at all. It's actually much more radical than that, much more fundamental. So hopefully that offers some clarity. If you enjoy what we're doing, please subscribe, share, and consider leaving a 5-star review either on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play. Those reviews really help the show. And if you enjoy this series, we'll continue through this book. I'll give a break of a couple episodes in between. And yeah, let me know. Give me some feedback. I'd love to hear what you think of this. Thanks.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.